Hey, everybody. All right. Cool. All right, it's 5:30, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing today? How's everyone's long weekend?
Pretty good.
Good. Yeah, mine was restful. I did a lot of cooking yesterday on my day off. So my fiance has a coworker, like he's like the mayor of his retirement home. Now, why he's still working in his mid 80s, I don't even know. But apparently there's a big problem because like all the old people in this retirement home, they have a lot of time on their hands, so they love to garden, and so they have a plethora of like oranges and lemons and grapefruits that is way too much for these old people to consume. So and so they regularly give them out. So my fiance has been taking home a steady stream of like oranges and grapefruits, and so yesterday I turned just a bunch of those into a bunch of orange juice and a bunch of grapefruit juice. So that was it was a relaxing day to kind of spend my day. But hopefully, everyone was able to relax a little bit. Judging from my last class, it seems like it was the weekend was too short and not long enough. But it's better than nothing, I suppose. Okay. And so today the plan is I'm going to give kind of a short lecture here on medical imaging. Okay. And so since on Thursday the plan is to have our first vascular workshop, I thought just a little bit of background information on medical imaging would kind of help give some context of how we're going to just for that workshop. Okay. Because in that workshop, what we're going to do is I'm going to give everyone basically the same set of a CT scan of a real person. And we're going to basically build a model of that person's blood vessels. Okay. And so basically, if you have just some kind of basic understanding of, how that medical image is obtained and, what other medical images are, I thought this would be kind of the perfect time to kind of talk about this, because it does play a big role, in not only in of course, in cardiovascular medicine, but also, in a lot of the work that we do as engineers as well, because a lot of times medical images are either used to diagnose disease so that, we can design devices, or, if for some cases, a device might already be implanted inside a person, and then medical imaging is used to assess how it's doing. Okay? So, just kind of we're not going to go too much in depth because honestly, this whole field of imaging, which is called radiology. People go to med school for this, so we're barely going to scratch the surface. But just having kind of some basic understanding, I think, is really helpful for us going forward. Okay. And so since I don't think that's going to take up the whole time, after that I'm going to start the next set of lecture notes, which is on arterial biomechanics. Okay? And so most of that we're going to go over next week, but I thought we'll use up as much class time as we can today to start that as well. Okay. All right. And so today you should have gotten an email from me with instructions on how to download and install some vascular. So have people given that a try yet? Have people been able to download that and install that on their computers?
It was pretty easy.
Okay. Okay, good. Yeah. So if you guys can download and install some vascular before the workshop on Thursday, then you'll basically be ready to kind of hit the ground running. So definitely try to take care of that. And if you run into any issues, definitely let me know. And so in the video you can see I did the install in Windows because I have a Windows machine, and so obviously I haven't tested it in Mac. So if you're running into issues on Mac, definitely let me know, and I can get in touch with the dev team to kind of help you guys out with that. Okay. So are there any questions on just anything that we covered last week, or on the homeworks, or anything I can answer before we get started? Okay. Right. So so let's go ahead and get started. And so this is our lecture notes on medical imaging. Okay. And so this presentation is very brief. It's only 15 slides, but we're just going to go over just kind of a quick overview of everything. Okay. All right. So first, let's talk about what is medical imaging. Right? And so when I talk about medical imaging, what I basically mean is basically the use of any kind of medical diagnostic equipment that can be used to obtain visual information of a patient's internal organs. Okay? So that means that either their anatomy or their physiology. Right? And so some examples that you've probably heard about just in passing are things like X-rays, MRIs, and ultrasounds. Okay? So we're going to go over all of those today and kind of explain what those are and a little bit of how the technology kind of works behind them. Okay. And so the reason we do medical imaging is to basically obtain information that you otherwise can't obtain just by looking at the patient. Right. And so, the information that you gain from medical imaging can be used to assess, first of all, the health of the patient. It can be used to diagnose disease or, for research. Okay? Again, today we're just going to briefly just cover the different types of imaging, explain their physics, and discuss a little bit of their applications. Okay. And so if you've ever gotten any medical imaging done, so if you've gotten a CT or an MRI, probably the image on the right is probably familiar to you. Right? And so, this kind of setup is very common where, they have kind of a, the system that kind of goes all the way around you, and you kind of lay in like, and it kind of slides you on the inside, okay? And it probes you from all around. And so, this is kind of what you would experience if you're getting a CT or an MRI, but there's also other types of imaging as well. So you can also get an ultrasound, which is what I'm showing in the bottom right here. Okay. And so kind of the different types of imaging all about, but for this class, since this is a class on cardiovascular biomechanics, essentially, we're going to focus on just the imaging that's useful for, for the cardiovascular system. Okay. Okay. Any questions on any of this? Okay. All right, so I'm going to split the type of imaging into kind of two separate categories. Okay, so the first category that we'll talk about is called structural imaging, and so what this means is basically just to provide information on geometry and motion. Okay, and so we're literally looking at just the structure of the bones and any other internal organs within a person's body. Okay, and so the vast majority of the things we're going to talk about today is structural, just because that's usually the input for what we usually work with. So, some common types of this are like X-rays or CTs or MRIs. Okay? But there's another type of imaging out there called functional imaging. And so in addition to structural, what functional imaging aims to do is to provide information on physiological function. Okay. And so what I mean by that is things like blood perfusion, right? So basically how much blood is saturating a certain area, right? Or things maybe on the chemical or biological function of the body. Right? So there's types of imaging out there that can actually view these things in addition to the structure, in addition to kind of the geometry inside a person. Right? And so oftentimes, for functional imaging, you have to do something more than just sticking someone inside an X-ray tube, right? And so oftentimes we have to inject what's something called a contrast agent that can travel through the system or travel through your body that can be picked up by that imaging. Okay? And depending on how well that contrast agent spreads out or how much it's picked up by the body, then we can say something about its biological function. Okay? But the vast majority of imaging that's typically done in routine care, and the vast majority of imaging that we'll look at in this class will be strictly structural. So we'll basically get just imaging on just what the geometry looks like without really any additional information of cardiovascular function. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about X-rays. So X-rays is probably the technique that everyone's familiar with. So I think everyone kind of knows, basically how an X-ray works. And the reason is because it's one of the oldest forms of medical imaging. So I think some of the first, known documentation of X-rays go all the way back to the 1800s. So way long ago. Okay. And so the way it works is that, X-ray radiation is produced within a device called an X-ray tube. And then from those are shot through a patient. Okay. And so you're basically shooting radiation through the patient. And then on the other side of the patient, we have a device called an X-ray detector. And so the detector is going to collect these X-rays and kind of create almost like a 2D image, like a 2D imprint. Okay. And so the reason this works is because as the X-rays travel through your body, they're going to attenuate or basically scatter, depending on the types of tissue that is going through. Okay. And so probably the most common application for X-rays is to image bones. Okay. And so bones, as we know, are primarily made of calcium, where there's high amount of calcium in there. Right? And the thing with calcium has a very high atomic number. And so that means it has a very large number of protons and neutrons and electrons. Okay. And so when X-rays try to travel through calcium and it tries to go through all of these, protons and neutrons and electrons, it kind of really struggles to do that. So, as the X-ray travels through bones, it's going to attenuate, or it's going to scatter the X-rays a lot more than just skin or stuff like that. Okay? And so basically, this difference in attenuation or difference in scattering of the X-rays can be picked up by the detector, and that will allow you to basically create these kind of very beautiful, very vivid images of inside the body. Okay. And so kind of, just like kind of what was mentioned on the previous slide, you can kind of enhance the attenuation of certain X-rays by injecting something in your body. Okay. And so this is very common to image the cardiovascular system, because normally, blood flow by itself, doesn't have a lot of, chemicals in there that are high atomic number. And so what you can do is you can inject something like iodine into your bloodstream, and that will help to attenuate the X-ray rays. Okay? And that will basically allow you to use X-rays to image, the blood, your blood vessels, and also your gastrointestinal tract. Okay? So for gastrointestinal, or like, your stomach and your intestines, typically they use barium for that. Okay? All right, any questions on this so far? Okay, and so kind of the next step up from X-rays is called computed tomography, or CTs. Okay, and so CTs, even though it has kind of a very different name, are use basically the exact same technology as X-rays. Okay, but the way that CTs work is that whereas before on this previous slide, the X-rays are kind of shot in one direction, and the X-ray tube is fixed and the detector is fixed. Right. For a CT scan, basically what you can think about it is like the X-ray detector and the X-ray tube are kind of rotating around the patient very, very quickly. And all that time it's basically shooting out the X-rays and basically taking snapshots at different angles around the patient. Okay. And so just to kind of give you some numbers about this, it rotates so fast that it basically pulses, and it creates images so fast that every time the CT rotates, it collects about 1,000 images. Okay. And so, this is actually really beneficial because, you're going to have, let's say, 1,000 images, but they're all going to be taken at a slightly different angle from each other. Okay. And so what you can do from there is you can take all those images that are a slightly different angle, and you can basically use that to kind of construct kind of a 3D data set. Okay. And so instead of just having a flat 2D image that you would get just from a traditional X-ray, by kind of reconstructing the image from, taking it from all different angles, you can actually create a three-dimensional data set, okay? And so, you know, the way that it's usually processed, and actually, you know, the way that we'll view it in Synvascular on Thursday is you basically view it as like a stack of X-ray slices, okay? And so you can almost think of it as like you took an X-ray at one angle, at one depth here, you took an X-ray here, another here, and all of those are kind of stacked on top of each other. And by stacking, you know, you can imagine, you know, you have a stack of, you know, 1,000 papers, you're eventually going to get like a three-dimensional object. And that's kind of how CT scans work. Okay? Yeah, different modalities. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good, Ronald makes a good point. So they call it different modalities of imaging. Yeah. And so you can almost think of CT scans as, you know, if you know, if any of you guys remember the Matrix, right? Remember, if you remember, one of the really cool visual effects for the Matrix was bullet time, right? Where like, you know, someone would jump into the air and then it would seem like time would freeze, and then, you know, the camera would change into a different angle, you know, and then, you know, from the different angle things would resume, right? And so if you ever looked at, you know, how that was created, it was the way that they did that was they kind of had a gallery of like, you know, thousands of cameras all at slightly different angles, kind of in like a circular pattern around, you know, the actor. And then once the actor jumps, basically all those different cameras are basically capturing the same image just from different angles. And then what you can do in post-processing is that you can kind of basically splice all those together to make it seem like a very dynamic scene where like you're stopping time, rotating around, and then kind of resuming there. Okay? So CTs are kind of similar to that, where you're taking basically a bunch of X-rays at different angles and then, you know, working them in kind of post-production to kind of create this kind of 3D image set. Okay. And so for the kind of, you know, simulations that we're going to be doing in Synvascular, CT is actually the most common modality that we'll work with, because the thing with CTs is that you know, the spatial resolution on the images from CT are really, really good, right? And so you know, if you look back at these X-ray images here, you know, you have a very clear, crisp image, and you see a lot of the little details of the bones, right? And so with CT, you kind of get a lot of those same benefits, but in a three-dimensional image. Okay, and you know, when you're imaging these really tiny blood vessels where their diameters can be, you know, 0.1 centimeters, having that spatial resolution is really, really beneficial. Okay. Okay. Any questions on any of this so far? Okay. All right. And so one thing, you know, to worry about with both X-ray and CT, and this kind of gets brought up a lot, is the danger of radiation. Right? And so, you know, because with X-rays and CTs, you're basically shooting radiation into a patient, you know, there's always some risk and there's always some fear of, you know, of that causing a mutation, right? But, you know, I will say that the technology today has advanced quite a bit, and the amount of radiation that's used in X-rays and CTs is very, very minimal. So like extremely unlikely to actually cause an event within the person. Okay. And so this idea that, you know, you should be scared of radiation in X-rays and CTs is kind of at this point becoming kind of a misconception that a lot of people are having about these things. It's not that the danger isn't there. You know, anytime you shoot radiation inside a person, there's always going to be a risk. But, you know, they've basically improved the technology to the point where, you know, that risk is almost basically negligible at this point. Right? And so, you know, if you're ever, or you or a loved one are ever faced with a situation where, you know, there might be some disease or something wrong, you know, on the inside of a person, you know, fear of radiation should never stop you from getting a medical scan, right? Because the chance of, you know, the radiation from the scan, you know, causing a mutation inside your body, that chance is often much lower than the chance of, you know, never discovering some kind of disease and having it, you know, be within you for a long time. Okay. And so if, you know, of course, you know, there's a lot of other reasons not to get medical scans. Financial is kind of the big one, but, you know, radiation shouldn't be a primary concern. That's kind of my point for this. Okay. And so the next type of imaging that we'll go over is MRIs. Okay, so MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging. And so MRIs are typically used to image soft tissue. Right? And so if you're a Lakers fan, you've probably heard in the news recently that Anthony Davis is having some issues with his Achilles. And so, you know, in order for the doctors to basically diagnose and assess what's wrong with that, they basically would put him through an MRI. Because the advantage of an MRI is that MRI is able to much more easily image soft tissue than CT. Okay, Because CT, you're kind of limited to basically either bones or places where you can inject a contrast agent. And so, that worked well for blood because blood is kind of a single tube. But for muscles, it's a little bit harder to inject, contrast in there. So that's why MRIs are typically done for that. Okay. And the really interesting thing about MRIs, and the interesting thing is a lot of people kind of share this opinion too. So even radiologists, where you go to the clinic and you talk to them about this, kind of everyone kind of has the same opinion, is that when you read about how MRIs work, kind of the thing that everyone thinks is, how the fuck did someone come up with this, right? It's because it seems like it's just such a convoluted process of like so many different things working together. And it's like, how the heck did someone even come up with this, right? Of course, you can say a lot of things. You can say that about a lot of things in science and engineering, but MRI is one thing where it's like, I don't even know how they came up with this, right? And so, this one slide here is not doing justice to the entire process. So, if you really want to read up on MRIs, kind of the rabbit hole goes really, really deep on that. Okay, but kind of in very, very brief terms, the way MRIs work is they basically work by controlling the magnetism of the nuclei of all the atoms within the tissue, right? Right. And so the thing is with these atoms is that some of them can have an odd number of protons or neutrons. Okay, and this is significant because for these kinds of atoms, hydrogen being one big example here, because hydrogen is the first element in the periodic table, so it just has one proton. Okay, what happens when you apply a magnetic field to these kinds of atoms is that it produces a spin. Okay, and then what you can do from the spin is that you can actually manipulate it with an additional radio frequency. Okay. And so basically, when you expose hydrogen atoms to either 1.5 Tesla or 3 Tesla magnetic fields, these hydrogen atoms will start to spin, and the exact frequency that the hydrogen atoms spin at is either 64 megahertz or 128 megahertz. Okay, and it just so happens that this frequency range is also within the same frequency range as radio waves. Okay, and so basically, the way these work is that when you go into an MRI machine, a giant magnet around you will basically put a magnetic field through your body, and that will align all of the hydrogen atoms in your body along with that magnetic field, and also kind of cause it to spin. Okay. Then what will happen is that an RF transmitter will basically tilt these moments, so that will emit a different signal, and then that will cause the magnetic fields to tilt. Okay. And then from there, what you can do is you can basically pulse the RF transmitter on and off. And then basically from there, you can observe how the spins tilt and things like that to get an image out of it. Okay. Of course, I'm butchering this whole thing because it's I only have a textbook definition of this and basically how one of my friends explained it to me. But that's kind of just the very basics on how it works. Okay. And the reason this works for soft tissues is that a lot of the elements that make up human tissue are made up of atoms that have an odd number of protons or neutrons. Okay, many of these which happen to be hydrogen. Okay, and so hydrogen actually makes up 62% of the mass inside a human, and so most of those being in water actually. Right, so a lot of the human body is comprised of water, and so the hydrogen that's in those water molecules can be subjected to MRI imaging, basically. Okay. And the interesting thing about MRI is that it's still being heavily researched to this day. So as much as you hear about it in news and other in the clinics, there's still a lot of research to be done, right? Because the exact sequence through which you pulse this RF frequency, depending on that sequence, you're going to get different types of imaging and different types of tissue that show up. And so here on the bottom right, I basically am showing you an example of two images you can kind of see they're of the exact same thing, but they use a different RF signal sequence. Okay? And so depending on the sequence, you get different things that show up, and different things show up either brighter or not. Okay. One funny story about this is that I had a good friend of mine actually take an MRI class when I was in graduate school. And he asked me to be kind of a test subject, so he took an MRI of me. But being a sleep-deprived grad student, I actually fell asleep inside the MRI machine, which is very difficult to do, because if you've ever had an MRI, like a full body MRI, you should notice, like, when the magnet is on, it actually produces a lot of heat. So it actually gets really hot in there. And like as the magnet is operating, it's actually really, really loud too. So actually when you go in, they give you these, noise canceling headsets, but you can still hear it quite a bit. So my friend was like, how the hell did you fall asleep in there? It's like, it's so hot and so noisy, but I was tired that day. Okay, so any questions on MRIs here? Okay. All right, so that's MRIs. And so MRIs, not as common as CTs for cardiovascular imaging, because the spatial resolution on MRIs is not as good. It's pretty good. I mean, it's not bad, but CTs often give you, much more resolution. So, most of the images that we'll look at are going to be CT images. Okay? But MRI can be used, and you can use MRI to image blood as well. Okay, and so the next modality that we'll look at is ultrasound. Right? Oh, question. So how is MRI conducted? Same as a CT? Yeah. So actually, for the patient, it actually looks very similar. So when you go into an MRI machine, it looks very similar to this. And so you're basically going to lay down, and you're going to go inside a tube, right? And then the tube is basically going to image you. You go in there for a bit, and then you come out. Right? But what's going on the inside is kind of very, very different. And so the thing about MRIs is, because it's basically a giant magnet that's going to be placing a magnetic field through you. You can't have anything with metal on you, otherwise it's going to go flying and possibly kill you. So whenever you get an MRI, they ask you like 7, 8, 9, 10 times, like, do you have anything metal on you? Like, do you have any coins in your pocket? Do you have anything that can trigger the MRI? Or worse, do you have a pacemaker in your body that can that will literally be ripped out of your body and kill you, right? And so with an MRI, you can't have anything metal inside there. So that's kind of one big difference in between them. Yeah, they're really strict about the metal stuff, because it's crazy. And if you ever go inside an MRI room, you'll notice that there's nothing metal inside an MRI room either. And so the room itself is actually they design it such that so the magnetic waves don't go outside that room, and then everything inside that room is either made of plastic or some kind of non-metal conducting surface, so that things just don't go flying everywhere when you turn on the MRI machine. I actually had a colleague in graduate school too, where she did experiments with MRIs as well. And so she was basically using MRI to image fluid flow inside kind of a pipe. And all of her experimental equipment had to be non-metal too, which is very difficult, because if you've ever worked with pumps and valves and stuff like that, they don't usually make them in non-metal varieties. And so she had to do some very complicated stuff where, like, sometimes she had to have her pump outside the room and have it pump fluid inside, and have these like really, really long pipes, and then those cause a lot of issues too. And it's very interesting, and I'm glad I don't have to kind of deal with that. Okay. How strong? Oh, question. How strong is the magnetic force it causes? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have exact numbers for like the amount of newtons that it produces, but it's strong enough to to send like a metal chair flying. Yeah. Oh, I don't know if it can crush chairs, but it can definitely send them. It can definitely send them across the room. Yeah. Yeah. It's not like the magnets are crushing things, but it kind of just sends them flying, almost as if gravity was kind of flipped sideways. That's kind of what I've been told about that. Yeah. It'd be awesome to see, but maybe not so awesome to experience. And most of the time they don't want that to happen, because an MRI machine is several $1 million, so they don't want a coin going in there and breaking up the machine. Yeah. Okay. And so the next modality that we'll look at is ultrasounds. Okay. And so ultrasounds, the way they work is to pass sound waves inside a person. Okay? Hence the name ultrasound. And so kind of very similar to X-ray. So when you put a sound wave through a person, these sound waves are going to scatter and reflect based on the density and basically based on the chemical composition of the tissue. Okay? And so ultrasound basically works by sending a sound wave into a person and then seeing what comes back and how long it takes to come back. Okay. And so an ultrasound probe kind of has two components. So it has one thing that will emit the sound wave at a very high frequency, and it also has what's called a transducer. And the transducer will basically be able to pick up on these sound waves. Okay. And so depending on the sound waves that come back to the transducer, based on how long it takes and the amplitude of those waves, then you can reconstruct an image from that. Okay? And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of post-processing that goes on in an ultrasound machine, because to go from sound waves and different time pulses and to create like an image on the bottom there, it's very, very complicated. Okay? And the thing with ultrasound is that this is probably the most accessible one that you'll find. So, in ultrasound, you don't have to go into a big fancy machine. Ultrasound just kind of takes place like you just sit in a doctor's office and they kind of move the probe around you like this. And so it's the most pleasant because you don't have to kind of get all dressed up about it. But, it also produces the lowest quality image. Okay? And so on the bottom right here, you can see an ultrasound of a person's heart. Okay. And I will tell you that, if it weren't for this highlighting right here, it will just look like just a blob. Okay. And so ultrasound, a lot of times you won't be able to get too much useful information out of it just because the resolution is so poor. But, there is one very unique thing that you can do with ultrasound, and that's actually to utilize the Doppler effect. Okay? So do you guys remember what the Doppler effect was from probably your previous physics classes and stuff? Okay. So basically the Doppler effect, kind of the example that's used a lot is, you're standing on the street and you see a fire engine driving towards you, right? And as the fire engine comes towards you, the sound of the siren sounds different because the speed of that moving object is affecting, the sound waves that actually come out and it hits your ears, right? And so ultrasound can actually make use of this to actually measure blood velocity, okay? Because as you can imagine, blood is constantly flowing inside your body. And so if you fire a sound wave with that, the sound wave is going to bounce off that blood flow that may be either coming towards the transducer or away from it. Okay. And that's going to affect the frequency that the transducer observes. Okay. Because if the blood was completely still, then you just have simple reflection. It bounces and it comes back. But when the blood is moving, you're going to have you're going to have sound waves that reflect off, the blood that's kind of moving towards the transducer. Right? And so what people have discovered is that they can use this to basically measure, what some of the velocities are. Okay? And so that's what you're seeing in this image right here, where, from this ultrasound, even though it looks like just a gray blob, it's using the Doppler effect here to measure, some velocities, right? And so in the red right here, you have velocities that are, I think, coming, I think that's velocity that's going away from the probe. Okay, so that's velocity that's going into the page. Okay, and in blue right here, you have velocities that are coming towards the page. Okay, and so this is kind of our first example here of functional imaging, right? So remember, functional imaging was all about taking these medical images and seeing what else can we get besides geometry. Okay, and so the Doppler effect or Doppler ultrasound is one such case where you can actually measure velocities. Okay? And again, the resolution is very poor, so it's you're not getting that much information. But what this is typically used for in practice is to look at the valves inside a person's heart. Okay, and so they often use Doppler ultrasound to see if you have a leaky valve. Okay, because if you image a person from the right direction, right, what you should see is that the flow should only go in one direction through the valve, right? And but what they can do is that if you use Doppler ultrasound, you see some flow coming back towards the valve, okay, then you have a problematic valve. You don't really have to know exactly how much flow is coming back. Just the fact that you have blood coming back through is enough for the doctor said maybe we should go and do something about your valves, because from this Doppler ultrasound we saw that you have kind of faulty valves. Okay, and this is obviously very attractive because otherwise, if you want to get an MRI or a CT to look at your valves, it's a much more involved process, right? But if a doctor can just sit in his office and stick a probe on you and say you have leaky valves, that's much more preferable, especially especially from the patient's point of view too, because a lot of times for CTs and MRIs you have to schedule an appointment. Sometimes it can take weeks to do. And so even though the resolution is not great, but this one thing about ultrasound makes it really, really useful for cardiovascular flows. All right, any questions on this? Okay. Okay. And so we've gone over kind of the three, I think, kind of the three main categories for these types of imaging. And so I'm including this table here just so you can kind of compare them. Okay. And so we didn't go over SPECT imaging or PET scans just because they're not as relevant for for cardiovascular imaging. So I want you guys just to focus on these three columns here. Okay? And so the first thing that should draw your eye here is the cost. Okay? And so capital cost, you can basically think of this as the cost of the machine itself. Okay? And so this is from 2015. Okay, and so you can see an MRI machine is really, really expensive. Okay, and it's only gone up since then. And so so when the doctors basically tell you that you can't bring anything metal inside the MRI room, it's not because they don't like fun stuff. It's because they spent a ton of money on that machine and they don't want anything to kind of mess it up, right? Okay. All right, and so the other thing I want to draw your attention to is the spatial resolution. Okay, now remember I talked about one of the big advantages of CT is you get much better spatial resolution. Okay. And so you can see that here. So with CT, you can have a spatial resolution as small as 0.4 millimeters. But for MRI, you can see it's almost twice as big, right? So you go from 0.4 to 1, which might not seem like that big a difference, but it makes a huge difference, right? It basically makes a difference between whether you can see a capillary or if it just appears as just an amorphous blob. Okay? So that makes a big difference. Okay? The other thing is that CTs are often a lot faster too. And so because you don't have to deal with this whole RF sequence and all that stuff, acquiring a CT is very quick. So it takes place within a matter of seconds. But an MRI takes a really, really long time. So that's kind of another consideration as well. Okay. And then the other thing is radiation, which is what we talked about before. So CT, since it's an X-ray type of imaging, you're going to have some radiation, but MRI and ultrasound is not. And you can look at kind of the rest of the numbers in this table if they're interesting to you as well. Okay. And so, those three imaging modalities that I just talked about are what I like to classify as kind of the non-invasive imaging. Okay. And so those are imagings that don't require, something to be stuck inside your body. Right? For a CT scan, you might have a little injection, but that's usually a minor thing. But there's also some other kind of more invasive types of imaging that can occur. And so, usually a lot of those types of imaging utilize this device called a catheter. Okay. And so if you haven't heard of a catheter before, a catheter is basically like a wire probe that they stick inside your body. Okay. And so you can see in this image down here, they're sticking this catheter up from the person's leg. Okay. And it's actually pretty amazing too, because a lot of times, when catheters are inserted, a lot of times they're interested in something around the heart. So they actually inject in the leg, and they kind of snake the catheter around your body until it gets into your heart. And so how people have the manual dexterity for that is really, really interesting, or really, really skillful. And so I don't think I would be able to do that. Yeah, so Ronald brings up a good point here. So you can also inject the catheters at other parts of your body. And so I would say this is probably the most safe for work image of a catheter, injection that I could find. And so if you looked up catheter injections online, you would see a lot of other images that are, maybe not as appropriate. I know you guys are mature enough to handle this, but it's maybe not. If Dean Susan looks up my lectures on YouTube, I don't want her to see an image of a penis on my screen. Although now I just said penis. So, but typically for cardiovascular, catheters, they inject it into the leg. Okay. And so, as you can imagine, catheters are not pleasant. So having something injected into you is never pleasant. And the thing with catheters is that they inject it and then they stick it there. Right? And so patients try to avoid this as much as possible. But the thing with catheters is that you can produce probably the best images possible with catheters because the camera is actually inside your body. And the thing with catheters too is that you can actually implant medical devices as well. Right? So if we'll talk about stents later on in the semester too. And so the advantage of a catheter is that you can image inside a person, and then if they see something wrong, they might be able to treat it all in one session right there. Okay. But generally, people try to avoid this because it's not the most pleasant thing. But catheters are actually but there's levels to this too. So a catheter is actually more preferable than open heart surgery. So there's all kinds of levels to this. Okay. And so the type of imaging that can be used with catheters, there's two. So there's one called IVUS and there's one called OCT. Okay, and so IVUS stands for intravascular ultrasound. and then OCT stands for optical coherence tomography. Okay? And so both, I grouped these guys together because they both are kind of two sides of the same coin. And so they both kind of require the injection of a catheter inside a person. It's just the way that they create the images is slightly different. Okay. And so IVUS, which is what you're seeing on the right here, is basically an ultrasound which takes place from inside your blood vessel. Okay. And so basically what the catheter is doing is that it's just the same as an ultrasound probe. So it's emitting sound waves at a very high frequency and then seeing how those sound waves come back. Okay. And then based on that, they're able to get images of these of the vessel cross sections, which you're seeing here. Okay. And so these images, you can kind of think of them as kind of you're looking down the barrel of a blood vessel, and you're kind of seeing the cross section. Right? And so this is really useful if the person has some kind of obstructive blood vessel disease, right? Because you can actually go in and actually see the exact shape of the plaque, which is really, really useful. Okay. And so OCT is very similar to IVUS, so it's going to be it's going to take place at the end of a catheter, but instead of ultrasound waves, it's going to use infrared light. Okay. And then from that, you're able to produce these kind of almost sci-fi looking images. Right? But these are real. These are not these are not fake. Okay. And then again, from these, you're able to get beautiful images of the cross section, which normally are very difficult to get with like CT and MRI. Okay. Especially in a place with where you have a lot of plaque and it's kind of very, very complicated. CT kind of really struggles with those kind of complicated plaque, but with OCT you can kind of see the evolution of that plaque really, really well with resolutions that you can only dream of with CT. Okay. Okay. So any questions on catheter-based imaging? Okay. Okay. And so those are all the modalities of medical imaging that I want to go over. So let's talk about just some applications really quick. All right. So the first application, and this is kind of the primary one that we'll be working with, is simply just to view the geometry of the blood vessels and to view any kind of motion. Okay. And so this is what you'll see when we do our symbascular workshop on Thursday. That from the medical images, you're able to basically trace out what the blood vessels look like. And you're able to produce kind of a 3D, kind of almost like a SolidWorks type model of the person's blood vessels. Okay, and this would not be possible without medical imaging, right? But besides just looking at the geometry, there's other really interesting things that you can look at as well. Okay, and so we talked a lot about plaque, right? And so a lot of times when doctors image inside a person, they're interested in seeing how bad are the narrowings inside this person's blood vessels, or how bad is the plaque. And so, just by looking at the person from the outside, it's impossible to tell. And so a lot of times you actually need to go with the medical image so you can see things like this, right? And so you can see on the left right here, you have a relatively healthy blood vessel. But on the right, from the medical image, you can see that this blood vessel has narrowed quite a bit. Okay? And so this is an area where, this person is likely to have some pretty significant disease. And the doctor can assess, how bad is the disease, and do we have to operate, okay? Another application is you can image the heart, and so you can image, how much your ventricles are filling with volume throughout the cardiac cycle. Okay, and that can be a measure of how healthy your heart is. Another application here is aneurysm. So I know a lot of you guys in the first homeworks talked about aneurysm coiling and aneurysm clipping. Okay, and so aneurysms are one thing where a lot of times it's impossible to know that they exist without doing a CT scan. Okay? And so from the CT scan, the doctor can see how bad the aneurysm is and can decide whether they want to do a coil or a clip, or sometimes even leave them alone too. Okay. You can use imaging to look at if there are any organs that have been malformed within newborns. Okay, and so this is fairly common as well. And you can also use it to view cardiac motion. Okay, and so you can use it to image how the heart is moving with every heartbeat. Okay, and so another application that imaging is used for is to measure blood velocity. Right? And so we talked about Doppler ultrasound before, and that's kind of the primary one. But there's other applications as well. Right? And so actually there's a way that you can use MRI to measure blood velocity too. So that's called a PC MRI or phase contrast MRI. Right? And so that's another way to kind of view velocity. and from this velocity, you can use it to assess a lot of things, right? So we talked about leaky valves, right? And that's kind of the primary one. And you can also use to measure the flow waveforms to make sure that they look healthy. Okay? And so probably after this set of lecture slides, we'll talk about what the flow waveform should look like inside a person's blood vessels. Okay? And so if the flow waveform looks abnormal, then that might be some hints that that there's something wrong with this patient as well. And I'll say right now that this image and most images that you see in textbooks are extremely misleading, because you very rarely get very beautiful images like this. So, you can believe it or not, but like this is extremely clear and extremely beautiful of an image. So most of the times, these images are not this nice and not this pretty. So you're going to see a lot of static. You're going to see a lot of kind of weird stuff in these images. So the textbooks never do a good job of telling you kind of a lot of those bad cases, because a lot of times the textbooks, they want to show off kind of the nice stuff, right? And so this is especially true when you're measuring velocities, because I worked with a lot of these images when I was in grad school, and a lot of times I'll look at the image, and I'll have no idea what's going on because it just looks like static. And I bring it to the doctor. He's like, "Oh yeah, you don't see it? It's right there. It looks like this." And I'm like, I would have no idea how to look at that. But that's kind of the difference between an engineer reading these images and a doctor or radiologist who's trained dozens of years of their lives to look at these types of images. So it takes not only good obviously it takes a good engineer to design this equipment, but it also takes a trained eye to kind of interpret these images as well. All right, question. So how great of a medium is blood for sound waves to travel? So blood actually, in terms of its viscosity and in terms of its density, is very similar to water. And so, a lot of the same properties that, that water has in terms of, how sound waves travel, blood inherits a lot of those same quantities as well. Yeah. And so, the big difference between blood and water is that blood has all those cells, but a lot of times those cells are kind of too, like red blood cells, white blood cells, those cells are kind of too small to kind of cause any that big of a difference. And so, if you kind of remember from your previous fluids classes that, because water is a lot more dense than air, sound waves travel a lot faster in water than they do in air. So blood kind of inherits a lot of those quantities as well. And so, things like, sound waves and vibrations, they travel a lot faster in blood than they do in air, because it's a liquid and it's a lot more dense than air. Okay. And so I have one final slide here on functional imaging, right? And so, if you remember from before, functional imaging, it's meant to provide, any kind of information on physiological function. So not only just, geometry and velocity, but, how well is the heart working, or how well is this muscle at, absorbing blood, right? And so I've given you some kind of 3 examples here that I've kind of seen, both in the textbooks and also in practice. And so probably the most common of these functional imaging is called perfusion, okay? And so perfusion, the way perfusion works is that, you inject a contrast agent into a person's bloodstream, and then you image not the blood vessels, but, where the blood is going to, right? And so you can image a muscle and you can see how well does that contrast actually perfuse into that muscle, right? Because if you can image, how well that contrast agent perfuse in, that tells you how well that muscle is at, at taking in blood, okay? And this is significant because, you should have a healthy amount of perfusion at your different muscles, like especially around your heart, right? And so cardiac perfusion is a very intense area of medical interest, because you want your cardiac muscles to absorb, hearts or the blood, all the oxygen and the nutrients, because your heart is a muscle that never stops, right? And so you want to make sure that your cardiac muscles are getting all the oxygen and nutrients that it needs. And so so perfusion imaging is primarily performed around the heart, but you can also image other places as well. Okay. And so another type of functional imaging is myocardial architecture. Okay. And so this is a specialized kind of MRI technique to image the microcirculation around the heart. So all the capillaries and all the really tiny blood vessels around the heart. You can image those with myocardial architecture. Myocardial sounds similar, but not quite. Yeah, myocardial architecture. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then the last type of imaging, which I admit that I don't really know that much about, But there's a big section of that in one of the textbooks is inflammation imaging. Okay? And so, the inflammation response in your body is, a very important thing that happens when your body is, senses something that's wrong. Okay. And so to kind of monitor that, what you can do is you can inject a special type of glucose and then image that with a special MRI sequence. Right. And so this is, something that can be done to image inflammation, which normally, as you can imagine, is really hard to do, because inflammation is something that takes place on the inside. You might be able to see some signs of it from the outside, like you can see your muscle is inflamed, but when it takes place on the inside, it's really hard to image. So, having a special imaging modality for this can be really, really useful. All right. So, any questions on these medical imaging notes? All right. Okay. And so, that this lecture right here, it's obviously it's not an exhaustive, lecture. We only just spent 45 minutes talking about medical imaging, but I at least wanted you guys to be kind of aware of, that medical imaging is an important part of the process, because otherwise we'd have no way of knowing what's going on inside a person's body. Okay. And so, when we do our workshop on Thursday, I'm going to give everyone a CT scan of a person's body, and you'll see that will allow us to view their blood vessels and can reconstruct, of a structure from that. Okay, and so we still have about half an hour in class left. So I do want to transition into our next set of lecture notes, which is arterial biomechanics. Okay, and so let me go ahead and switch to my iPad here. And then while that switch is occurring, are there any questions that I can answer? All right, so question, is Simvascular used outside of research, or is there a different software? Yeah, that's a good question. So right now it is mostly a research tool. There is a version of Simvascular that's used by companies. I know one company in particular called HeartFlow. They use their own in-house software, which they don't like to share the details of that because it's proprietary. But I know that it's a derivative from Simvascular, so it works in very similar ways. But they've kind of improved it and kind of taken it off in a different direction, because they do want to do something very specific in the company. But for most cases that I'm aware of, Simvascular is mostly a research tool. And so that whole process of 3D reconstruction from CT and MRI, yes. Yeah, so Ronald makes a good point too. So, this whole thing that we'll see on Thursday of, taking a medical image like a CT or MRI and then reconstructing a 3D geometry, that's definitely not just limited to biomedical as well. So there's definitely a lot of fields that can use that too. Because if you can imagine, you can use it to image on the inside of like a machine, that might be, either too difficult or impossible to kind of open up. And so, if you want to see what's going on with, with the flow on the inside, you can use kind of similar techniques as well. Yeah. And of course, in experimental fluid mechanics as well too, or microfluidics, I know is kind of a big field for this too. So, even though we'll be discussing this within the context of cardiovascular flows, a lot of these techniques and a lot of these, concepts can be taken to other fields as well. So that's a great point. Okay. All right, and so the next lecture notes that we're going to go over is a lecture notes that I like to call arterial biomechanics. Okay. And so actually, this was something that I didn't have planned for until later on this semester, but I thought this would be a better time to talk about it because we had just gotten done talking about the Navier-Stokes equations and how it can be used to model blood flow, and we use that to derive the very important Murray's law. And so Murray's law, is very important, but it's only kind of just one piece of the puzzle that kind of describes, how blood flow happens in a person's body. Okay. And so, the idea with this set of lecture notes is to kind of talk about kind of just some general behaviors and general physics that you can kind of expect within the cardiovascular system, just to kind of set the table. Because, from here, we're going to be talking about a lot of different modeling techniques. So, some vascular being one of them. But, the week after that, we'll be going over something called a lump parameter modeling. Okay. And so I want to talk about this now because, I want you guys to always keep in mind, what are some things that we're looking out for in the cardiovascular system, and what things should be included in our models. Okay. Because some models will be good at one thing, whereas some models will be good at something else. Okay. And as we do different kinds of computations, you should be aware of, what are the kinds of things that our computations are looking to emulate. Okay. Because if you just go into, if we just go into, running a CFD code, we can of course, push all the buttons and we can run a simulation. But, the reasons why we push certain buttons and the reasons why we make certain decisions, a lot of those aren't clear unless you have a good understanding of, what are the general behaviors that you expect within the cardiovascular system. And so that's the point of this lecture notes, is to talk about, what are some general behaviors that we can expect, in like things like the pressure waveforms, things like the flow waveforms, what are some things that we should look out for in our models. Okay, because it's at this point in the class that we're really taking off from more basic fluid mechanics to more applied fluid mechanics. So, what are some specific things about cardiovascular flow that we should look out for that you wouldn't normally see in fluid flow in a pipe. Okay. Right. And so this is arterial biomechanics. All right, so I specifically call this arterial biomechanics because this is the biomechanics within your arteries. Okay, because if you remember, you not only have arteries, but you have veins in your cardiovascular system. But it turns out arteries are usually the one where more interesting things happen, and arteries are the ones where more disease tends to occur. Right? You can have disease in your veins, of course, but usually the more deadly diseases and the ones that that are more deadly are the ones that happens in your arteries. Okay. Okay. And so the point of this is to talk about general behavior of cardiovascular system, or cardiovascular mechanics, I should say. And the reason we're doing this is that this will help us inform our models. All right. And so the first thing I want to talk about is the flow and pressure waveforms that you typically see inside arteries. Okay. Okay. And so the first thing that I'll note is that when you're measuring flow and you're measuring blood pressure and blood flow inside the cardiovascular system, the first thing that you should notice is that the flow is pulsatile. Okay. And so what that means is that you don't have just a steady amount of flow. The flow is going to go up and it's going to go down. Okay. Or in other words, it oscillates. Okay. And so the reason it does this is because of the pulsatile nature of heart contraction, right? And so if you measure your heart rate right now, you can feel your heart going ba-dum, 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 right? And so it's not a steady amount of flow, right? So your heart is basically contracting and then relaxing, contracting and relaxing, contracting and relaxing. Okay. And so as you can imagine, when the heart contracts, then things like flow and pressure in your arteries are going to be high, right? Because your heart is squeezing, and that's squeezing, a lot of flow to go through your body. Okay? Okay. Right. Yes. So yeah, Joshua brought up a good point. So this is where the term systole and diastole comes in, right? And so remember, systole is what happens when your heart is fully contracted, and diastole is when your heart is relaxing. Okay? And so this is always happening inside your body, right? So your heart's always contracting, relaxing, systole, diastole. Okay, and this causes the flow and pressure waveforms in your body to go up and down. Okay, and so let me draw the flow waveform first. And so here on the x-axis here is time. Okay, so this is a waveform that's observing time, and then on the y-axis here, this is going to be flow. Okay? And the typical units of flow that we measure in the cardiovascular system is usually milliliters per second. Okay? And so often the flow waveform looks something like this. Okay? Draw it in red. And so at first, the flow is going to go up. Then you have a little bit of reverse flow, and then the flow kind of goes down like that. Okay. All right. And so you can see here, we have kind of two different zones here. Okay. So let me kind of draw a dotted line just like this. Okay. Right. And so on the first part of this waveform right here, you see that the flow kind of reaches a maximum. Okay. And so this is what happens when the heart contracts. And so when the heart contracts, you can imagine your heart is squeezing, and so that's going to cause flow to shoot up into your blood vessels. Okay. And then afterwards, you have this period where there's very little flow. Okay. And so this is when the heart relaxes. Okay. And so when the heart's relaxing, there's nothing really to drive the flow forward, and so the flow kind of comes down from there. Okay. Right. And so kind of to put this within the terminology from before, this would be systole over here, or heart contraction, and this would be diastole, or heart relaxation. And so that's kind of what a typical flow waveform looks like. Right? And so you have a high amount of flow in systole, and then either no flow or very little flow in diastole. That's when the heart's not really doing anything; it's just relaxing. Okay. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. So that's the flow waveform. So now let's look at the pressure waveform. Oh, a question. So when they do heart transplants, do they mimic the same flow, or is it better to have steady blood flow? Yeah, so that's a good question. So when they do heart transplants, they want to mimic basically the same flow waveform, right? And so the reason for that is remember the cells inside your blood vessels are lined with a bunch of cells, right? And so they're used to this kind of up and down motion of the flow, right? So they're used to high flow, then low flow, high flow, low flow. And so if you kind of introduce a different kind of pump into the system where you have steady flow, I think that's going to cause a lot of those cells to kind of maladapt, because it's going to be something where they're not used to feeling flow kind of all the time, right? Because remember we talked about the wall shear stress. And so when you basically when you're performing heart transplants or anything like that, or actually later on we'll talk about a device called a ventricular assist device. Actually, some of you guys looked at that for your homeworks as well. They try to mimic the same waveform as much as possible, kind of because ideally the rest of your body shouldn't have to know that your heart is missing or that you have a device in there. So for the rest of your body, you want it to kind of be business as usual, so that it kind of performs its usual function. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So here is the pressure waveform. Okay. And so on the x-axis here, we're going to have time as well. Okay. And on the y-axis here, we're going to have pressure. Okay. And so the pressure waveform looks something like this. And so we have it go up in systole. Okay. Then it starts to go down. There's a little bit of a blip, and then it goes down just like that. Okay. All right. And so just like before, we can kind of differentiate kind of two zones for this. Okay, and so in this first zone we have heart contraction. And over here we have heart relaxation. Okay. In other words, we have systole and diastole. All right. All right. So what you should notice from this pressure waveform, are a couple things. Okay. And so first, when the heart contracts, you can see that our pressure goes up very rapidly. Okay. But the rate at which the pressure decreases is a lot slower than the increase. Okay, and so pressure decays more slowly. Okay, and so that's on purpose. And so when your heart contracts, it causes a big rise in blood pressure in your system. But then when the heart relaxes, it actually takes the pressure a while for it to go back down to its diastolic value. Okay, and we'll talk about kind of why that is in a second. Right? But it's mostly a matter of the fact that you have basically flexible blood vessels. Right? But we'll get there. Okay? But first, let's talk about how how these waveforms can actually change shape as you get away farther from the heart. Okay. Because if you measure the flow and pressure waveforms at different parts of your body, you're actually going to see kind of two different things. Okay, so they kind of follow these same kind of general shapes, but they're not going to be completely the same. Okay, because as you get further away from the heart, then the blood vessel is going to branch, and also a lot of other things happen. So let's talk about kind of some of the general behaviors or how these waveforms change depending on the physical location. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the one thing for the pressure waveform first. Okay. And so first, let's talk about peak systolic pressure. Okay. And so this is basically the absolute maximum that the pressure waveform tends to have. And so as you get further away from the heart, peak systolic pressure tends to go up. Okay. Okay. And so if you measure, your blood pressure waveforms, right by your heart versus, in your arm or something, then you should actually see a higher peak pressure inside your arm because that's, the blood has traveled a lot more of a distance to get there. Okay. Right. All right. So that's peak systolic pressure. Now let's talk about flow or total flow. Okay. Right. And so as you get further away from the heart, the magnitude of the flow tends to decrease. Okay. Okay. And the reason for this is fairly simple, because we know, you know, blood obeys, conservation of mass, just like any fluid. And so we know that, as we get further away from the heart, your blood vessels are going to tend to bifurcate into, lots of different branches. Okay. And so it makes sense that as the flow splits, each individual branch is carrying less flow than its parent branch, right? Because the same amount of flow that was in the parent has to be split off into all the daughter branches as well. Okay. And so, the fact that you observe lower flows is just a consequence of, of the blood vessel splitting off into different paths, right? Yeah. All right, question. So wall shear stress. Yeah. So if you remember from lecture last time, the wall shear stress actually stays very similar. So, at different parts of the cardiovascular system, the wall shear stress that you observe is actually very similar to, wherever you are, right? Because even though the flow is going down between each of the blood vessels, the radius of the blood vessels are also going down, right? So we talked about that in Murray's law. And so, with the smaller radius, even though you have a smaller flow, then the wall shear stress tends to be the same. Yeah. It's not exactly the same. It's hard because wall shear stress is something that that can vary a lot. But it kind of tends to stay in the same neighborhood. All right. And so the third thing I want to talk about is when the peak of pressure occurs. Okay? And so peak systolic pressure as you get further away from the heart, we already know that peak systolic pressure tends to increase, but it also tends to lag. Okay? And so the peak of systolic pressure, as you get further away from the heart, happens at a later point in the cardiac cycle. Okay? And so, 1 and 3 here, or the reason, 1 and 3 occur, are actually due to the same thing. So this is due to a phenomenon called pressure wave propagation. Okay? And so we'll talk about that in a lot more detail probably next week. But because of this pressure wave propagation, this causes the pressure waveforms to kind of change shape as you go further along into the arterial tree. Okay, and that change of shape occurs because or that change of shape basically means that your systolic pressure is going to be higher, and it's also going to occur slightly later. Okay, and so basically, if I kind of draw a comparison graph here, so I'm going to draw this in purple. Okay? And so let's say that this occurred, somewhere close to the heart. If we measure the pressure waveform somewhere farther away, like let's say in your fingertips, it might look something like this. Okay. Right. And so pressure waveform in fingertips. Okay. And so you can see from this diagram here that the in the fingertips, you would expect the peak systolic pressure to be higher, right? So our peak is at a higher location here, and it's also delayed, right? And so it's also shifted to the right a little bit, right? And so both of those occur due to pressure wave propagation, right? But we'll cover that in a lot more detail next week. All right. So the last thing I want to highlight in these graphs, which you might be wondering about up to this point, is this little, what I call like a little blip, right? And so we have this kind of little thing that happens here, and we have the same thing in the flow waveform too. So in the flow waveform, you can see we have this little thing right here, right? And so that's not a typo. So I drew those on purpose, and so that blip basically occurs because your aortic valve is closing, right? And so as you can imagine, when your heart is contracting, your aortic valve is going to open and let blood flow into your system, and then when your heart is done contracting, then the valve is going to basically suddenly shut close. Okay? And so that motion, and because your aortic valve is kind of very relatively big, that big motion right there actually causes, that actually affects the flow and pressure waveforms throughout the rest of your body, right? And so, that causes the pressure to kind of take a momentary dip as kind of the valve kind of, you can almost think of it like it's pulling flow back towards itself, right? And so as it pulls flow back towards itself, it causes the pressure to momentarily dip, and it causes the flow to actually, kind of go negative for a second too, because that valve kind of pulls itself back and it pulls, the blood along with it. Right? And as you can imagine, as you move farther away from the heart, the effect of this, aortic valve closing gets less and less, pronounced. And so actually maybe more accurate of the fingertip waveform might look more something like this. Where you can kind of see a little bit of a valley in there, but it's not as pronounced, right? And that's because as you get farther away, the valve is not going to have as much an effect. Right? Right. The flow time looks like an ECG test a little bit, yeah. It kind of looks similar to that, yeah. Right. And so the technical term for this little blep right here, so it's not called a blep. So don't go to a doctor and say, oh, there's my blep. It's actually called the aortic notch. Yeah. All right. So questions. There's an air bubble in my IV line. Should I panic? So I think that's a fairly common occurrence, but I think the IV tubes are kind of designed to kind of make sure that doesn't occur. Or that doesn't present any kind of danger, because you can imagine, those IV bags are, they're handled kind of roughly because they're flexible, and so people, they throw them up, they hook them up, they're handled pretty good. So bubbles tend to occur, but I think they're designed such that those don't cause any issues. But I'm not that familiar with the design of IV bags, but that's kind of what I've kind of heard just in passing. But that would definitely be something good to look up. Right. So if someone had poor blood flow in their legs as a diabetic patient, a second device further away from the heart could compensate. That's a good question, actually. The thing is with kind of assist devices like that, they tend to be kind of bulky. It's hard to have like a device that assists blood flow that's not kind of big. And there's kind of very few places in your body where you have a cavity big enough to have an assist device. And so, the thing is with your leg, and for a lot of, places in your body, it's very densely packed muscle. So it's kind of very hard to put a device in there to kind of assist blood flow. And so even if you do have a poor circulation in your legs, if they did have to do like additional pump, they would put that near your heart because you have kind of a big cavity there. Or they might do something like they might put a stent into your leg to kind of open up the blood vessels there. If that would be the issue. So it kind of really depends on kind of the nature of, what's causing the poor blood flow in that person's body to begin with. But for a diabetic patient, I would imagine that it's probably their blood vessels are getting pretty stiff and kind of maybe contracting on itself. And so maybe a stent would probably be better at kind of opening those things up. Yeah. Right. So if we increase the ratio of gases to fluids within the blood, would the pressure be more efficient? I've never thought about that before. I'd have to kind of think about that a lot and kind of get back to you. But I think generally you don't want that much gas in your cardiovascular system, because you don't want gas that's passing through your capillaries, because that's your capillaries kind of rely on very, very tight contact with the blood so that it can extract all of its oxygen and nutrients. But I don't know if there's anything out there where you can put gas into your bloodstream to make it more efficient. But it would be interesting to look at. Right? Yeah. So that would be the main thing I'd be worried about, would be of composition. Yeah. Okay. So that's all we got time for today, and so I'm a little bit over time. And so on Thursday, we're going to be doing our Symbascular workshop. So make sure you have Symbascular installed by that time, so you can follow along. So I mean, of course, I'm not going to collect anything from the workshop, so you can just sit and watch. But you'll see that when we get there, that you're going to want to follow along, because it's not the most straightforward process. And so if you're kind of following along with me, I think you're going to get a lot more from the workshop than just kind of watching me do it. Okay. All right. So thank you guys for tuning in today. Have a good evening, and I'll see you guys on Thursday. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, Professor.
Yep. Did you guys have any other questions? All right. So if there's no more questions, I'm going to go ahead and close. I'm going to close the call. And so have a good evening, and I'll see you guys on Thursday.